1908, the ocean did not care what was printed on a ticket, yet a steamship could still divide the world into polished, quiet, and crowded warmth. When the Aster Vale eased away from the misted pier, it carried lace gloves and coal-stained cuffs, silver teaspoons and cracked teacups, all moving toward the same horizon with different kinds of courage. On the upper deck, comfort made promises in soft voices. Below, hope packed itself into narrow corners and learned to breathe there. And on that crossing, one gentleman, certain he understood how ships and society should be arranged, would begin to notice the deck where hope traveled light and the way it shone without asking permission. The morning harbor lay beneath a veil of fog, thick enough to soften the cranes and warehouses into pale silhouettes, as though the city had been sketched in charcoal and then gently smudged by a careful thumb. Damp air clung to wool coats and hat brims, and every sound arrived with a hushed delay. The clop of a horse's hoof somewhere behind the pier, the creak of rope under tension, the low calls of dockmen that seemed to travel through cotton. In the center of it all waited the steamship Aster Vale, immense and patient, her dark hull beaded with moisture and her funnels rising like watchtowers into the gray. A steady thread of smoke drifted from her stacks and dissolved upward, leaving a faint tang of coal that mixed with salt and wet timber. Along the quay, a line of passengers moved in measured currents, each person carrying something that could not be checked with a porter. A plan, a longing, a promise. Mr. Edmund Ashford arrived as if he had timed his steps to a pocket watch. His coat was neatly brushed, his gloves uncreased, and his suitcase looked as though it had been set down more often in hotel lobbies than on rough ground. He paused just long enough to take in the ship's name painted in clean letters near the bow, and then he turned his gaze to the gangway, where uniformed staff guided first-class passengers onward. For Edmund, travel was an arrangement of sensible details, tickets, trunks, meals served at the proper hour, and he moved through the damp bustle with the calm of someone who believed the world, at its best, resembled a well-managed room. Even the fog seemed courteous up here, keeping its chill at a distance, while polished brass fittings caught what little light there was and held it. At the base of the gangway, a steward nodded, checking Edmund's papers with practiced ease. The man's hands were quick, the sort that could fold a blanket with sharp corners and close a door without letting it click. Edmund returned the nod with the small, restrained politeness he had learned in drawing rooms, never too warm, never too familiar, then stepped onto the wooden planks that led him aboard. The ship answered beneath his feet with a gentle vibration, like a faraway instrument holding a steady note. Somewhere within the Aster Vale, engines murmured in preparation. Somewhere above, a gull called out, and then vanished into the fog as if it had been swallowed by it. From the railing of the embarkation deck, Edmund watched the harbor scene widen as he climbed. The quay was now a stage below him, the figures smaller and more numerous, their coats and shawls dark against the pale air. He saw, at a distance, the separate current of third-class passengers gathering nearer the aft entrance, where the crowd pressed closer together and the luggage looked more lived in. Trunks with rope handles, canvas bags patched at the corners, baskets tied shut with twine. There were fewer porters there, and more hands belonging to family members who lifted and steadied one another as naturally as breathing. Edmund did not linger on the difference for long. It registered as a detail of ship design, a division of traffic meant to keep the walkway clear. He turned away, allowing himself to be carried forward by the quiet confidence of first-class hospitality. Inside, the first-class corridor smelled faintly of lemon polish and warmed fabric. A patterned carpet softened footsteps into whispers, and the lamps along the walls gave off a honeyed glow that made even the fog outside seem an intentional decoration. Edmund's cabin awaited him with its tidy symmetry, a narrow mirror, a clean washstand, linens folded with careful precision. He set his suitcase down and removed his gloves, arranging them on the dresser as if the act completed a small ritual of order. Through a porthole, he could see only grayness and a suggestion of movement, like the harbor itself shifting on unseen hinges. He checked his watch, as though time might drift in fog if left unattended, and then he moved back toward the promenade deck to watch the departure. Below, where the ship's elegant hush gave way to more practical sounds, Nora Bell held her ticket between two fingers, as if it might evaporate. She was young enough for people to expect softness from her, yet her posture suggested a strength that had already been tested and found reliable. Her coat was plain, her hat pinned with care rather than fashion, and her eyes kept returning to the ship's height as though she were studying a cliff face before a climb. Near her stood a small trunk with scuffed corners and a label tied on with string. She touched it once, not to check its security, but as if to remind herself it was real, that she had carried her life to this pier and would carry it onward again. A few steps away, Tomasz Kowalczyk adjusted the strap of a worn bag across his shoulder. He was a broad-shouldered man with hands that looked accustomed to weight, and the coal-blackened grooves under his fingernails told their own story without words. He did not speak much, but he watched attentively, scanning faces and signage with the quiet caution of someone entering a new machine and wanting to learn its moving parts. When the line surged forward, he shifted aside to let an older couple pass, steadying the woman's basket with a brief, careful touch. It was not a gesture meant to be noticed. It was simply the sort of help that kept a crowded world from tipping. Lucille Marchand stood near a post where the fog gathered in slow swirls, her scarf tucked close against the damp. She held a small case, too slim for much clothing, too carefully clasped for mere trinkets, and her fingers rested on it with the familiarity of someone who had opened and closed it many times in quiet rooms. Her gaze wandered over the ship's windows and rails as though she were reading its shape for hidden meanings. If she felt nervous, she wore it lightly, like a thin veil rather than a heavy cloak. When a child darted between legs, chasing a dropped button across the planks, Lucille crouched and retrieved it with a soft smile, returning it to the flustered mother, as though she had handed back something more valuable than a button. A moment of composure. The dockman's calls rose, fell, and rose again, weaving with the ship's deeper sounds. Ropes were tightened, then loosened. A gangway shifted with a hollow thump. Luggage carts rattled and stopped. The Aster Vale seemed to gather herself, pulling all these small motions into a single intention. A horn sounded, low, long, and steady, its note rolling through fog and across water with a dignity that made conversation pause. In first class, Edmund heard it as a clean signal, an announcement that the day's next phase had begun. In third class, the sound pressed closer, as if it were speaking directly into ribs and lungs. You are going now. You are truly going. As the last passengers were counted and the pier began to slip away, the fog thinned just enough to reveal the faint outlines of faces turned upward. Some waved. Some stood still, as if waving might break the thin thread of courage holding them together. Edmund leaned lightly against the promenade rail. The chill air touched his cheeks, and the metal beneath his gloved hands held a cool steadiness. He watched the harbor recede, its buildings melting back into gray, and he felt the familiar satisfaction of departure, the sense of being underway, of leaving behind the untidy press of the dock for the controlled rhythm of a crossing. Yet as the ship turned and the water opened, a new sound drifted up through the ship's layers, not the formal music of the lounge, but something human and unarranged. Laughter, brief and bright, carried by the wind from below. It rose like a small bird taking flight, then circled once and vanished into the engine's murmur. Edmund found himself listening for it again, surprised by how clearly it had reached him through the ship's careful separations. He did not move from his place at the rail, but his attention shifted, as if an unseen door inside him had been left slightly ajar. When he glanced down toward the lower decks, he saw only partial shapes through the fog and railings, bundles, coats, a cluster of heads. But he had the distinct impression of a world continuing there, warm with voices, steady with purpose. The Aster Vale carried on into open water, her wake stretching behind like a pale ribbon laid upon the sea. Edmund remained on deck a moment longer than he intended, his gaze lingering where the sound had come from. It was nothing more than a stray fragment of joy, caught by the wind and delivered to him by chance. And yet it felt, oddly, like an invitation the ocean itself had chosen to send. By the second morning, the Aster Vale had found her rhythm, and the ocean seemed to accept the ship the way a wide road accepts a carriage, without comment, without hurry. The fog that had clung to the harbor dispersed into a higher, thinner haze, leaving a pewter light spread across the water. From the first-class promenade, the sea looked orderly in its own way. Long, even swells rising and lowering with steady patience, white threads of foam unspooling along the ship's sides. The air carried the clean, mineral scent of salt, softened by the faint sweetness of warm tea drifting from open doors whenever a steward passed. Every detail felt composed, as if the world had agreed to behave itself for the duration of the crossing. Edmund Ashford settled into the habits that first class provided as naturally as a well-cut coat. Breakfast arrived on time, the porcelain warmed, the butter pale and neat, the toast crisp at the edges. Conversations took place in a manner that never pressed too closely. Inquiries about business prospects overseas, polite remarks about the weather, a passing critique of modern fashions that sounded more like theater than conviction. Even laughter was contained and tasteful, like a garnish. Edmund listened, nodded at the proper moments, and offered a comment or two that had been honed in clubs and drawing rooms, words that fit without effort, and asked for nothing in return. After breakfast, he walked the corridor where lamps cast a soft amber glow on polished wood. The ship's gentle vibration, always present, seemed here to become a kind of reassurance, a reminder that immense forces could be managed with expertise and design. A steward passed with a folded blanket over one arm, the fabric immaculate, and Edmund barely registered the movement. Service was a feature of the environment, like the railings and the carpet, present and reliable. When he reached the lounge, he found it already arranged for the day. Chairs angled toward windows, a small table laid with papers and pens for those who liked to write letters to nowhere in particular, and, dominating the far wall, a large map showing the ship's route across the Atlantic. The map drew Edmund as a fireplace draws a chilled visitor. It was framed in brass and glass, its colors muted but confident, blue for the ocean, cream for land, a red line tracing a clean arc from departure to destination. A few gentlemen stood nearby, their hands clasped behind their backs, as if the map were an artwork meant to be admired rather than a practical instrument. Edmund moved closer, reading the names printed along the coastlines and islands, noting distances marked in careful numerals. He traced the red line with his eyes, measuring progress against time, and felt a quiet satisfaction in the thought that the world could be reduced to coordinates and crossings, to lines that promised arrival as surely as they promised departure. A small plaque beneath the map listed the ship's speed and the day's expected position. Edmund compared the figures to his own mental calculations with the mild pleasure of finding them aligned. It was not vanity so much as comfort, a confirmation that the world he understood, organized, measured, predictable, was still the world beneath the ship's steady motion. Behind him, someone spoke about investments, and someone else spoke about the latest opera in London, and the topics floated in the warm air like well-behaved balloons tethered to the same polished floor. When the steward approached to refresh the tea service, Edmund stepped slightly aside. The man poured with precision, the liquid making a soft, intimate sound against porcelain. His uniform was crisp, his shoes silent. Edmund offered a brief thanks, and the steward answered with the same courteous neutrality. Present, competent, and already turning away. Yet as the man moved, he glanced toward a side corridor and said, not as gossip, but as a matter of ship knowledge, "We've had a lively start below, sir. Third class always settles in by degrees. Plenty of families on this crossing." Edmund's response was automatic, a polite murmur that signaled acknowledgement without invitation. He did not ask for details. The steward's words landed in his mind as one might register a comment about cargo. Interesting in the abstract, irrelevant to the day's arrangements. Still, the phrase "lively start below" lingered like a scent that refused to vanish at once. It carried, faintly, the memory of that bright laughter he had heard the day before. Brief, wind-tossed, inexplicably clear. Edmund turned back to the map and let his attention anchor itself again to the red line and the numbers, as if measurement could replace curiosity. Later, he walked the promenade deck with a measured pace. The air was cooler now, the ship's wake a pale ribbon trailing behind, and the horizon looked like a pencil stroke drawn straight across the page of the sea. He watched a gull glide low over the water, then rise with barely a flick of its wings, and he admired the effortless economy of the motion. First class offered a particular kind of quiet, a quiet polished by distance. Even the sound of the engines seemed softened here, filtered through layers of structure and upholstery until it became a mild, constant hum rather than an insistence. Below and aft, in the areas Edmund did not enter, quiet took a different shape. Third class did not have as much space to offer silence, so it learned to make peace with sound. The corridors there were narrower, the air warmer, and footsteps could not help but announce themselves. Yet the noise was not disorderly so much as communal. Voices overlapping in many accents, a child's questions, a mother's soothing answers, a burst of laughter that rose and dissolved into conversation. People arranged their belongings with practical ingenuity. A scarf rolled into a pillow for a hard bench, a rope strung between two posts to hang a coat where it might dry, a folded newspaper used to protect a small tin of biscuits. The ship's restrictions became, in careful hands, something like a craft. Nora Bell found a corner where a draft did not creep under the door, and she turned it into a small domestic kingdom with gestures so modest they might have been overlooked by anyone not watching. She placed her trunk where it could serve as a table, smoothed her gloves on top as if claiming a bit of order, and arranged her papers in a neat stack that promised continuity. When she spoke to a neighbor, her voice was calm and low, the tone of someone who carried worry without letting it spill. Across from her, Lucille Marchand opened her slim case, revealing thread and needles wrapped in cloth, and she began to mend a small tear in a sleeve, with movements so precise they could have been musical if one listened closely enough. Tomasz Kowalczyk offered help without ceremony, lifting a basket to a shelf for an older man whose arms trembled with effort. He nodded once, then returned to his own bag, checking its knots and straps as though his hands needed the comfort of work. Around him, people discovered each other in small ways, shared matches, borrowed cups, translated words exchanged with patient gestures and smiles. The ship was a crowded village now, afloat on gray water, and its residents learned quickly which corners were warmer, which railings offered the best view, which stairwells were best avoided when crew hurried past with crates. Back above, Edmund returned to the lounge in the afternoon. A few passengers played cards with quiet intensity, their voices kept low as though volume might be impolite to the sea itself. Edmund sat with a newspaper that had already grown old in the time it took to leave port, and he read more from habit than from interest. His mind returned now and then to the steward's casual remark and to the idea, unwanted yet persistent, that the ship contained more than the world he could see from his polished deck. He found himself glancing at the map again, not just at the red line, but at the wide blue around it, as though the ocean's openness hinted at other kinds of distance, not miles, but the separation of lives within the same vessel. In the late light, the glass of the map reflected the lounge behind him, the chairs, the lamps, the orderly posture of those who sat in comfort. For a moment, Edmund saw his own face overlaid on the printed ocean, and the effect was oddly instructive, as if the ship were asking him to consider where he truly stood. He looked away, unsettled not by fear, but by the gentle pressure of a question he had not chosen to ask. When he rose to leave, a steward held a door open, and, in the same neutral tone used for weather reports, mentioned, "The air's particularly fresh near the forward stairwell this evening, sir. Some passengers like to stand there a while before dinner." Edmund thanked him and stepped into the corridor. The information was small, almost meaningless, and yet it carried the faint suggestion of a different viewpoint, another place to stand, another angle on the ship's moving world. As he walked, the hum of the engines seemed to deepen into a steadier note, and somewhere, far below and aft, a ripple of voices rose and softened again, like waves against the hull. Edmund did not change his course, not yet, but he held the steward's remark in mind as if it were a card slipped quietly into his pocket, an invitation to notice, when the time came, that the ship contained more than one kind of horizon. That evening, the Aster Vale wore a different kind of brightness. The sun had lowered into a band of diluted gold near the horizon, and the ship's windows gathered the remaining light as if each pane were a small, careful keeper of warmth. Along the first-class corridor, lamps were lit in a steady progression, their glow traveling ahead of passing footsteps. Dinner bells chimed softly, not as an order, but as a gentle reminder of routine, and the air carried layered scents, broth, roasted meat, citrus peel, suggesting comfort prepared by unseen hands. Edmund Ashford moved through it all with the calm readiness of someone who understood schedules, yet his attention kept slipping toward the faint seam lines of the ship, the doors that led elsewhere, the stairwells that disappeared downward, the small signs that indicated routes meant for other people. He had intended only a brief walk before the meal, the sort of pacing that made a man feel he had earned his seat at table. The steward's earlier comment about fresh air near the forward stairwell returned to him, and Edmund followed it with the same practical obedience he might give to a recommended brand of tea. The corridor narrowed slightly as he went, the carpet giving way to a simpler runner, and the conversations around him thinned. Near a set of doors, the ship's vibration seemed more present, less muffled by plush walls. It was as though the Aster Vale let him hear her machinery more clearly When he stood closer to her bones, the forward stairwell was indeed cooler. A faint draft traveled along the steps, carrying the bracing scent of open air and salt. Edmund rested his hand on the rail, and for a moment, he simply listened. Above, somewhere out of sight, the wind made a soft, continuous sound around the ship's superstructure. Below, the engines continued their steady hum, and between those two layers of sound there was a quiet corridor of stillness that felt oddly spacious. He took one breath, then another, letting the salt air clear the day's polite chatter from his mind. When he turned to return, he chose the wrong door. It was not a dramatic mistake. No sudden alarm, no urgent voice calling him back. It was only the small misjudgment that happens when a ship contains many identical panels and when a man, thinking of maps and measurements, assumes the world is laid out according to his expectations. Edmund stepped through, and the air changed at once. The corridor beyond was warmer and carried different notes: soap, damp wool, a trace of coal smoke that clung faintly to the ship's inner currents. The lighting was softer too, not because it was dim, but because it fell from simpler lamps and reflected off plain paint rather than polished wood. The carpet was gone, replaced by boards that responded to footsteps with honest sound. Edmund stopped, his hand still on the door's edge, as if the threshold might explain itself if he waited long enough. A narrow passage stretched ahead, lined with doors and hooks where coats and scarves hung in practical clusters. The ship's hum was louder here, no longer merely background. It was a companion presence, a steady pulse in the walls. Somewhere nearby, water ran briefly, and the sound of it, small, clear, unembarrassed, made the corridor feel inhabited in a way the first-class halls rarely did. He took a few steps forward, intending to find his way back quickly, and then he heard voices. They did not come in a single language or a single rhythm. They rose and fell like overlapping streams, sometimes converging into laughter, sometimes separating into quieter conversation. A child spoke in a bright burst, an adult answered with a softer cadence, and the exchange carried an ease that did not require the polished restraint of the lounge. Edmund felt an unexpected hesitation, not fear, but the mild disorientation of discovering a room behind a familiar wall. He had known, in the abstract, that the ship held hundreds of passengers beyond his own class, yet the reality of their living sound, close enough to be intimate, made that knowledge newly textured. He rounded a corner and found an opening that led toward the outer deck. The door there had been propped slightly ajar, as if someone had wanted the air to pass through without needing to ask permission. Edmund stepped out, and the wind touched his face with cool fingers. Here the sea looked the same as it did above, gray-blue, patient, wide. Yet the angle of the rail and the proximity of the ship's working structures made it feel like a different ocean entirely. The deckboards were worn and practical, the paint scuffed where many shoes had passed. A line of damp clothing fluttered overhead like modest flags, pinned with careful hands. The smell of salt was stronger here, braided with the scent of soap and warm bread. A group of women stood near the rail, talking while they tended to their laundry. Their movements were efficient but not hurried, and their conversation carried the kind of humor that grows from shared inconvenience rather than shared luxury. A young man leaned against a bulkhead, carving something small from a piece of wood with a pocket knife, his hands steady and patient. Two children chased each other in a slow circle around a coil of rope, their feet thumping lightly, their laughter rising like a gull's call and then darting away again. The scene held no performance, no attempt to impress. It was simply life continuing, layered into the ship's structure as naturally as rivets and beams. Edmund stood very still. suddenly aware of his own clothing, his gloves, the clean lines of his coat that marked him as belonging elsewhere. He expected, perhaps, a sharp look, a question, a hint that he had stepped where he ought not. Instead, what reached him was something gentler. Curiosity, yes, but also a kind of matter-of-fact acceptance that a ship sometimes misplaced people the way it misplaced luggage. A woman with gray hair pinned neatly at her nape noticed him first. She was stout and upright, with an expression that suggested she had organized many crowded rooms in her life and was not easily surprised by one more complication. "You've taken the wrong stair," she said, not accusingly, but as one might note that a button had been fastened incorrectly. Edmund cleared his throat. "It appears I have." The woman's eyes traveled over him, his coat, his gloves, the polished calm he wore like a badge, and then returned to his face. There was no resentment in her gaze, only assessment, brisk and practical. "It happens," she replied. "This ship has a talent for making doors look alike. Are you looking for the promenade? You'll want the other corridor, the one with the quieter boards." Edmund nodded, grateful for the simplicity of the answer. "Thank you. I didn't mean to intrude." The woman said, as if weighing the word intrude and finding it a little too heavy for the situation. "Well, you're here now. No harm in standing a moment, if you've a mind to. The air down here is honest. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than wind." A small smile tried to form on Edmund's mouth and found, to his surprise, that it could. He stepped closer to the rail, keeping a polite distance from the cluster of activity. The metal felt cooler than the brass fittings above, and the deck beneath his shoes gave a faint protest, a sound that seemed to declare his presence more plainly than any introduction. He watched the laundry lines lift and settle with the ship's motion, and he listened to the voices around him. They carried stories and fragments, a place name spoken with longing, a joke shared between strangers, a gentle scolding followed by laughter. Each sound seemed to soften the ship's strict divisions, as if the air itself did not care for boundaries. The gray-haired woman shifted her basket and adjusted a clothespin. "Name's Mrs. Price," she offered, as though names were tools useful for simple navigation. "Agatha Price. If you get turned about again, ask for me. I tend to know where things are, even when they don't want to be found." "Edmund Ashford," he replied automatically, then hesitated, aware of how his name sounded here. Long, polished, belonging to another deck. "And I appreciate your help." Mrs. Price nodded once, satisfied. Behind her, a young seamstress, dark hair tucked under a scarf, hands moving with delicate certainty, looked up from her work for a brief moment. Her gaze met Edmund's, calm and unreadable, then returned to the cloth in her lap. Nearby, a broad-shouldered man with coal-shadowed hands lifted a basket for an older passenger and set it down with quiet care. The gesture was small, but it carried a steady dignity that made Edmund's chest feel unexpectedly tight, as if some long-held assumption had been nudged slightly out of place. A child's laughter rose again, and the sound was caught by the wind and carried upward, perhaps toward the promenade where Edmund had heard it the day before. He realized, with a strange clarity, that this deck had been speaking to him already, reaching him through the ship's layers in brief, bright signals. The thought did not embarrass him. It humbled him in a way that felt clean rather than painful. Mrs. Price finished pinning a shirt and brushed her hands together. "If you're determined to go back up," she said, "I can point you right. But if you've a spare minute, you might watch the sea from here. It looks the same, but you see it differently." Edmund kept his hand on the rail and looked out at the water. The horizon was a thin line, steady as a promise. Behind him, the ship's many lives continued. Voices, footsteps, cloth flapping softly, making a kind of music that needed no instruments. He had not planned to be here, yet the deck did not seem to mind his mistake. It held him, briefly, in its softer light. When he finally turned toward the corridor that would lead him back, Mrs. Price lifted her chin toward a narrow passage. "That way," she said. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "If you come down again tomorrow, bring your ears more than your manners. Folks down here prefer listening to bowing." Edmund paused, surprised by the warmth that the words carried beneath their plainness. "I'll remember," he said, and meant it. As he stepped inside, the door swinging gently behind him, the voices of the third-class deck followed for a moment. Laughter fading into conversation fading into the steady hum of the ship. Edmund found his way toward the brighter corridor above, yet something of that softer light remained with him, as if he had walked through a place where the air itself offered an invitation to return. The following day arrived with a steadier sky, the sort of pale blue that looked rinsed and hung up to dry. The Aster Vale moved through the water with a calm confidence, her engines keeping time like a patient metronome. On the first-class deck, stewards opened curtains and straightened cushions as if arranging a stage for quiet comfort, and the morning carried the familiar scent of hot tea and polished wood. Edmund Ashford participated in the routine with practiced ease. Breakfast, a brief walk, a glance at the map. Yet his attention kept drifting, as though a small compass within him had been turned and was now insisting on a new direction. The memory of Mrs. Price's voice, brisk and unpretentious, followed him through the day like a thread that caught on his sleeve and refused to be brushed away. He told himself more than once that he had no reason to go below again. Curiosity was not a virtue in his world when it crossed class boundaries. It was merely a risk of awkwardness. Yet the ship itself seemed to offer him gentle opportunities. An unguarded corridor, a door left half open, a stairwell that breathed cooler air as if exhaling invitation. In the early afternoon, when the lounge had grown too orderly and the conversations too polished, Edmund found himself walking with deliberate care toward the forward stairwell. He did not rush, and he did not hide his movement, but he carried his intention quietly, like a folded letter. The stairwell's air changed as it had before, warmer, more textured, carrying the honest notes of soap and damp wool, and beneath them, the faint, steady tang of coal. The lighting softened too, as though the ship reserved her brightest gleam for those who paid for it, while offering everyone else a gentler glow that did not pretend to be gold. Edmund descended one flight, then another, his hand sliding along the rail. He expected to feel out of place, yet the sensation was less like trespassing and more like walking into a different weather. At the bottom of the stairs, he heard the third-class world before he fully saw it. Voices traveled through the corridor in layered strands, some low and murmured, some lifted in laughter, some threaded with song. Footsteps were more frequent here, and the boards spoke more plainly under each passing shoe. A child darted by with a strip of ribbon in hand, pursued at a slower pace by an older sibling who pretended sternness while smiling. The air held warmth from many bodies and the faint aroma of something simple simmering. Water, perhaps, with onions or herbs coaxed into it by patience. Mrs. Agatha Price appeared as if summoned by the thought of her name. She stood near a doorway with a basket folded over one arm, her gray hair pinned neatly, her gaze sharp enough to notice everything, and kind enough not to turn observation into judgment. When she saw Edmund, her eyebrows lifted in mild approval, the expression of someone who respected a person who kept his word. "Well," she said, in a tone that made the words sound like a tidy conclusion. "You've brought your ears, then?" Edmund inclined his head, a gesture of habit that he tried to soften into something less formal. I hope I have. I didn't want to impose, Mrs. Price. Impose is what the sea does, she replied, shifting the basket slightly. People simply adapt. Come on. If you're going to look, you may as well look properly and not hover like a ghost near the rail. She led him along the corridor with the unhurried authority of someone who knew the deck's hidden logic. As they walked, Edmund saw how the space had been shaped by necessity into something almost artful. Hooks on the walls held coats and scarves in tidy rows. Crates had become stools. A length of rope served as a boundary to keep luggage stacked without toppling. The ship's hum felt closer, as if he could sense the engines through the soles of his shoes, and yet the mood was not harsh. It was simply real, unbuffered by plush carpets and polished silence. They reached a doorway that opened into the sleeping quarters, and Edmund paused at the threshold. The room beyond was crowded, but not chaotic. Rows of bunks rose in tiers, each one tucked into place like a cell in a honeycomb, and each held small marks of its occupant. A folded shawl, a book wrapped in cloth, a tin cup hanging from a nail, a ribbon tied to a bedpost like a tiny flag of identity. The air was warm and smelled faintly of soap, bread, and the clean sharpness of sea wind that had threaded its way in. Light fell from small lamps and from a few portholes, turning the room's edges soft and making the crowd feel less like a press and more like a gathering. People think it's all misery down here, Mrs. Price said quietly, as though speaking to the room itself rather than to Edmund. But misery takes effort. Most of us haven't the time. We've plans to mind. As if in gentle answer, a voice rose from near the far wall, steady, calm, carrying the cadence of a woman who had learned to speak without wasting breath. "Agatha, is that you?" the voice asked. "It's me," Mrs. Price replied, "and I've brought someone who took the wrong stair yesterday and decided to learn something from it." Edmund felt a brief heat of embarrassment, but the room did not react with ridicule. A few heads turned. A few eyes noted his coat and gloves. Then most attention returned to their own tasks, as though the presence of a first-class man was merely one more variation in the ship's shifting pattern. The woman who had spoken stepped closer. She was young, though not girlish, with hair pinned back in a practical style and eyes that held a quiet steadiness. Her coat was plain and carefully mended at the cuff. She offered Edmund a small nod that was neither deferential nor dismissive, simply polite in a way that assumed he was capable of decency. "Nora Bell," she introduced herself. "If Agatha's guided you here, you're either lost or curious." "Perhaps both," Edmund admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "Edmund Ashford. I didn't intend to wander, but I'm grateful I did." Nora's expression softened slightly, as if she recognized something in his tone that mattered more than his name. "Grateful is a good word," she said. "It leaves room for everyone." Nearby, at a crate that served as a table, Lucille Marchand was stitching with precise, unhurried movements. Her dark hair was tucked under a scarf, and she held the cloth close, as though the simple act of sewing could anchor the day. She glanced up as Mrs. Price approached. "Lucille," Mrs. Price said, "this is Mr. Ashford. He's come to listen instead of simply looking." Lucille's gaze met Edmund's. Her eyes were calm and observant, and her smile, when it came, was small but sincere. "Then he will hear many things," she said. Her voice carried a faint musical lilt, as if her words had learned to dance lightly in the mouth. "Down here, sounds do not hide." Edmund found himself watching her hands. The needle rose and fell with quiet certainty, the thread drawn through cloth as smoothly as a line drawn on a map, except this line was meant to mend, to strengthen, to make something last. The comparison struck him with a gentle force. He had been admiring red roots across oceans while, here, a woman drew invisible lines that held a sleeve together, a life together, a future together. A broad-shouldered man approached, carrying a small bundle. His hands were large and bore the faint shadow of coal, yet his movements were careful. He set the bundle down near an older passenger, adjusted it so it would not slide, then turned toward Mrs. Price. "Tomasz," she said, as if introducing a familiar tool, reliable, useful, unpretentious. "This is the gentleman I told you about." Tomasz Kowalczyk looked at Edmund directly. There was no challenge in his gaze, only a steady assessment, as though he were deciding whether Edmund was someone who could be trusted with a simple truth. Then Tomasz nodded once. "Hello," he said, his accent present but his English clear. "Ship is big, stairs are tricky." Edmund let out a brief breath that might have been laughter if he had allowed it. "They are," he agreed, "and I'm fortunate to have met people who know them." Tomasz's mouth turned at the corner. Not quite a smile, but something near it. He gestured toward a bench along the wall, plain wood, worn smooth by many hands. "Sit," he offered, as though the matter required no debate. "Standing makes you look like you want to leave." The invitation was so simple that Edmund felt its weight. In first class, sitting was assumed. Here, it was offered. He removed his gloves slowly, folded them, and placed them in his coat pocket. Then he sat on the bench, careful not to take more space than necessary, and found that the room did not tighten around him. Instead, it continued breathing, voices threading past, footsteps passing, a baby cooing softly somewhere behind a curtain. Nora returned to her small tasks. Lucille resumed her stitching, and Tomasz leaned briefly against the wall, as if satisfied that the newcomer had made the first correct choice. For several minutes, Edmund simply listened. He heard a woman describing a cousin waiting in a city he had only ever known as a dot on a map. He heard a man discussing work prospects in careful, hopeful terms. Nothing grand, simply the wish for steady wages and a room where the walls did not leak. He heard Mrs. Price giving brisk advice on how to keep a cup from sliding on rough seas. The voices overlapped without clashing, each one a thread in a larger weave. The effect was oddly soothing. The ship's structure felt less like a hierarchy and more like a tapestry, and Edmund realized he had been living in only one corner of it. Nora stepped close again, lowering her voice so it would not carry. "You'll be expected upstairs," she said, not as a warning, but as a practical observation. "People notice when someone leaves their usual place." "I won't stay long," Edmund replied. "I only wanted to understand what I'd stepped into." Nora's gaze moved briefly over the bunks, the hanging shawls, the small tokens tied to posts. "It's not so complicated," she said. "It's people making room for one another, that's all." Mrs. Price returned to Edmund's side with her basket. "He'll go," she said to Nora, then looked down at Edmund. "But before you do, you'll take one thing with you." Edmund straightened slightly. "Yes?" Mrs. Price tapped the wall beside the doorway where a list had been pinned. Names, numbers, cabin assignments written in plain ink. "That," she said. "Upstairs you're a gentleman and a ticket. Down here, we're names on a paper. If you can remember one name, just one, and carry it as if it matters, you'll have done better than most." Edmund looked at the list, then at the faces around him. His attention settled, without effort, on the people he had already met. "Nora Bell," he said quietly. "Lucille Marchand. Tomasz Kowalczyk. Agatha Price." Mrs. Price gave a brisk nod, satisfied. "Good," she said. "Now you're not merely passing through, Edmund rose from the bench. The motion felt different than it would have upstairs, as if standing here required a small acknowledgement of the space he was leaving. He replaced his gloves in his pocket and offered a restrained, genuine inclination of his head to the group. "Thank you," he said, and the words did not feel like a formality. "For your time. For the seat." Lucille glanced up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "You may come again," she said, as if stating something as simple as the tide. "Some things are easier to understand the second time." Mrs. Price pointed him toward the corridor with a brief flick of her fingers. "Tomorrow, then," she added, not demanding, simply assuming possibility. "If you've still got ears to spare." Edmund stepped out into the passageway, the room's warmth lingering behind him like a held note. As he walked toward the stairwell, he realized he was carrying something new. Not a souvenir, not a story to repeat at dinner, but the quiet weight of names remembered and a promise gently made to return. The next day carried a gentler warmth, as though the Atlantic had decided to be hospitable. The sky remained pale and steady, the clouds thinning into long strokes like brushed linen, and the ship moved with a calm that made even the creak of her timbers sound like a familiar phrase repeated at the right moment. In first class, routine continued to perform itself with polished assurance. Fresh napkins, bright silver, the quiet choreography of stewards who seemed to appear precisely when needed and vanish before anyone could think to thank them. Edmund Ashford took his tea at the proper hour and listened to a conversation about ports and profits. Yet his attention was no longer fully held by such topics. Names had taken root in his mind: Nora Bell, Lucille Marchand, Tomasz Kowalczyk, Agatha Price, and they sat there like small, steady lanterns, illuminating corners of the ship he had previously kept in shadow. He waited until the afternoon, when the lounge grew drowsy with its own comfort, and the map's red line seemed to move too slowly for his curiosity. Then he excused himself with a practiced nod and walked toward the forward stairwell with the quiet intention of someone keeping an appointment he had not announced. The corridor shifted as he descended, wood less glossy, air more textured, the ship's hum less filtered. Each step felt like a small surrender of unnecessary formality. By the time he reached the lower passage, he had already taken his gloves off, folding them into his pocket as if leaving them behind in spirit, even before he left them behind in fact. The third-class corridor welcomed him with honest sound. Footsteps tapped, a kettle lid clinked somewhere, and voices carried in overlapping threads that made the space feel alive rather than crowded. Mrs. Price appeared near a doorway, as if she had been expecting him, though her expression made it clear she expected most things and refused to be impressed. "You've come back," she said, and the words held neither praise nor suspicion, only acknowledgement. "As you suggested," Edmund replied. "I hope it isn't inconvenient." "Inconvenient is when the sea turns a bucket over," she said briskly. "You're merely a man with curiosity. Come along, they're gathering." She led him toward a common area near the galley doors, where the warmth was stronger and the air held the faint sweetness of boiled water and something herbal. The space was plain: benches, a few crates, a table scarred by use, and yet it had a center, as if the people themselves had agreed upon an invisible hearth. At that center sat a kettle, large and darkened by years of service, its sides dulled from scrubbing, its handle wrapped in cloth. Steam rose from its spout in a steady ribbon, and the sound of it, soft, persistent, felt like a promise being kept. Edmund paused at the threshold. He had seen tea served in first class with delicate ceremony, fine china, sliced lemon, sugar tongs moved with polished ease. Here, the kettle was the ceremony. Its presence gathered hands and voices the way a lamp gathered moths, not in frantic swarming but in calm, necessary return. Cups were mismatched. Enamel mugs, tin cups, a chipped porcelain cup someone must have packed with great care. Yet each cup was treated with a quiet respect, as if the vessel mattered less than the warmth it carried. Nora Bell stood near the table. Her posture relaxed in a way Edmund had not seen in the departure crowd. When she noticed him, she nodded, and her eyes held the same steady clarity as before. "Mr. Ashford," she said, as if he were becoming less of an anomaly and more of a neighbor, "you've found your way again." "With help," Edmund admitted, glancing toward Mrs. Price. Lucille Marchand was there as well, her hands occupied not with needle and thread, but with arranging cups so that they would not slide when the ship rolled. She looked up and offered him that small, sincere smile that seemed to reserve warmth for moments that deserved it. "You are welcome," she said simply, and the words sounded like a door unlatched. Tomasz Kowalczyk sat on a bench with his elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped. He looked up at Edmund, assessed him in the same steady way, and then shifted slightly to make room. It was a quiet invitation that did not require gratitude as proof. It assumed Edmund could sit without taking more than his share. Mrs. Price took charge of the kettle as if it were a civic duty. She lifted it with practiced strength and poured into a row of cups, the water darkening as someone added tea leaves in a cloth bundle. A faint fragrance rose. Simple black tea, perhaps, with an edge of something else, like dried mint or a strip of peel saved from a rare orange. The steam carried it outward, and the scent braided itself into the room's warmth. Someone passed a tin of sugar, the cubes fewer than one might wish, and yet the tin traveled from hand to hand without anyone clutching it too tightly. Edmund watched, and something inside him softened. The kettle was not extravagant, but it was generous. It did not ask who had paid for which deck. It did not measure worth by clothing or cabin number. It offered warmth in a steady, democratic way, and the people around it responded with a kind of grace that was neither showy nor sentimental. They spoke in low voices, careful not to crowd one another, yet the care did not feel like restraint. It felt like consideration. Mrs. Price handed Edmund a cup. It was tin, warmed quickly, and the rim was slightly uneven from years of use. He accepted it with both hands, feeling the heat seep into his fingers. "Careful," she said. "It's hot enough to make you honest." Edmund found himself smiling again. "Then perhaps it's exactly what I need." He sipped. The tea was thin compared to the rich brew upstairs, yet it carried a clean bitterness that felt grounding, and the faint hint of herb softened it like a gentle hand on the shoulder. The taste was not luxurious, but it was alive, shaped by many small decisions. How long to steep, how much to share, how to make something modest feel sufficient. As the kettle circulated, conversation flowed. Not grand stories, not dramatic confessions, simply the texture of ordinary lives. A man spoke of a cousin who had written from New York, describing the streets as if they were rivers of people. A woman mentioned the kind of work she hoped to find, her voice steady, her hands folded as if she were already practicing patience. Nora listened with quiet attentiveness, occasionally offering a small comment that steadied the speaker, the way a hand might steady a teacup on a rocking table. Edmund said little at first. He listened as Mrs. Price had instructed, letting the voices wash over him. He heard accents he could not place and languages he did not understand, yet meaning still reached him through tone and gesture. The upward lift of hope, the grounded hum of practicality, the soft laughter that rose when someone made a joke about the ship's meals or the way the sea seemed to repeat itself endlessly. In first class, Conversation often served as decoration. Here, it served as connection. Tomasz, holding his cup near his chest, spoke at last. "Tea is not strong," he said, glancing at the kettle with a faint amusement. "But it is always there." Mrs. Price snorted softly. "That's the point. Strong tea is fine for people with cupboards full of it. For the rest of us, what matters is that it comes around again." Lucille added in her quiet musical voice, "It is like a small clock. It tells us the day is moving and that we are moving with it." Edmund looked at the kettle then, not as an object but as a symbol of a kind of shipboard order he had never considered. Upstairs, time was marked by bells and courses and scheduled promenades. Down here, it was marked by shared warmth, by a pot of water kept going through attention and cooperation. The realization did not make him condemn first class. It simply made him see that comfort had taught him to take certain things for granted, while scarcity had taught others to make them communal. A child wandered near, drawn by the steam. Nora reached out and guided the child back gently, her hand light on the small shoulder. Mrs. Price slipped a sugar cube into the child's palm with the discretion of a magician. The child's eyes widened, and the cube vanished into the mouth with solemn delight. No one remarked on it. The moment passed into the room's rhythm like a note in a familiar tune. Edmund found his gaze drifting to the tin of sugar as it made its rounds. Upstairs, sugar arrived in a bowl and one took it without thinking. Here, each cube was a decision, yet the tin did not linger at any one person's elbow. It moved, always, and somehow, even with so little, there was enough. The kettle steamed as if it would never empty, as if generosity itself kept the water rising. He felt then a small discomfort, not sharp, not accusing, but instructive. In his world, giving often came with spectacle. Charity dinners, plaques, public gratitude. Here, giving was a quiet habit, practiced in small motions that made the whole day gentler. Edmund realized he had been taught to believe respect could be optional, reserved for those who matched his station. But in this room, respect moved as naturally as the sugar tin, passing from hand to hand without question. Nora looked toward Edmund, as if sensing his thoughts without needing to name them. "It surprises you," she said softly, not unkindly, "that we make it pleasant." "It does," Edmund admitted. "Not because I thought you couldn't, because I never thought about what it takes." Nora's expression remained steady. "It takes people," she said. "That is all. People who notice each other." Mrs. Price reclaimed the kettle for another pour, topping off cups with the authority of someone ensuring the world stayed properly stitched together. She glanced at Edmund. "You'll be due upstairs soon," she said. "They'll wonder where their gentleman has wandered." Edmund held his cup a moment longer, feeling its warmth, listening to the soft clink of metal against metal, the low hum of voices. He did not want to overstay, to turn welcome into burden. Yet he also did not want to leave as if this were merely a curiosity collected and put away. Lucille, arranging cups again, spoke without looking up. "Tomorrow," she said, as if continuing a thought begun earlier. "There is often a little singing near the laundry lines when the wind is kind." Mrs. Price gave a short nod as if confirming a schedule. "Yes, the lines make a fine place for a voice. Tell him, Lucille, if he wants to hear the ship properly, that's where the music finds him." Edmund rose, careful not to disturb the bench. He inclined his head toward the group, less formal than before, more sincere. "Thank you," he said, and this time the words felt like they belonged here. "For the tea, for the clock, as you put it." Tomasz lifted his cup in a small salute. Nora nodded. Lucille's smile returned, brief and warm. Mrs. Price waved him away with brisk affection. "Go on then." And if you come tomorrow, don't bring anything fancy. Bring your attention. That's what most people are short of. Edmund stepped back into the corridor, the kettle's steam trailing after him like a gentle ribbon. As he climbed toward first class, the warmth of that thin tea seemed to remain in his hands, and Lucille's mention of singing under the laundry lines settled in his mind like a promised meeting with a quieter kind of music. The morning breeze arrived with an easy confidence, as though it had been invited and had chosen to keep its promise. The Aster Vale moved through a sea the color of brushed steel, and the sky above held a mild clarity that made the horizon look freshly drawn. Sunlight, filtered through thin cloud, fell in pale sheets that drifted across the deck, warming the painted railings in patches and leaving others cool to the touch. Even the ship's constant hum seemed gentler today, less an insistence and more a steady accompaniment. In first class, windows were opened a fraction wider, curtains stirred, and stewards spoke in softer tones, as if the air itself encouraged a quieter kindness. Edmund Ashford felt that change as he walked. He took his breakfast, nodded at familiar faces, and listened to a discussion about shipping lanes that sounded now more like polite rehearsal than genuine interest. The map in the lounge still showed the red line, still offered its reassuring distances, but Edmund found himself looking past it, toward the window where a slice of open sea could be seen. It was not that the map had become meaningless, it simply no longer felt complete. There were other routes on this ship, routes made of voices and shared cups, routes that did not appear in ink. When the hour felt right, he excused himself without explanation, folded his gloves into his pocket, and made his way down the forward stairwell with the quiet confidence of someone following a new kind of schedule. As he descended, the air changed, and with it, the ship's mood. The scent of polish faded, replaced by soap and damp cloth, and the corridor's sounds became less padded. Footsteps spoke more plainly. A laugh slipped around a corner like a bright ribbon. A woman's voice called out a name, sharp, affectionate, practical, followed by the soft scuff of a bucket being moved. Edmund's own presence felt less conspicuous than it had on his first mistaken visit. He was still marked by his coat's cut and his posture, yet familiarity had begun to smooth the edges of difference. The ship, like a town, seemed to notice who returned. The third-class deck opened before him with a gust of clean, salt air. Overhead, laundry lines crisscrossed between posts and rails, strung with shirts, scarves, and linens that fluttered like pale flags. Clothespins held fast with a determined simplicity, and the wind tested each knot and clip without malice, merely performing its duty. Sunlight caught on damp fabric and made it briefly luminous, turning ordinary cotton into something almost ceremonial. The scene carried a quiet charm, as if the ship had dressed itself in soft banners to celebrate an unspoken holiday. Another day afloat, another day closer to land. Mrs. Agatha Price stood near the lines, hands on her hips, assessing the wind the way a captain might assess a chart. When she saw Edmund, her expression shifted into brisk approval. "Good," she said, as if he had arrived on time for a lesson. "The wind is kind. It doesn't always bother to be." "I came as Lucille suggested," Edmund replied, letting his voice stay low, as though he were entering a chapel rather than a working deck. Mrs. Price grunted. "Lucille suggests sensible things. Stand where you won't get in the way, and don't look like you're judging the cloth. It's just cloth." Edmund obeyed, stepping closer to the rail, where he could see the sea lifting and lowering in steady breath. Around him, people moved with practical grace. A woman pinned a child's sock to a line, then smoothed it with her palm as if blessing it. An older man shook out a towel with a snap that sounded like a small drumbeat. Two children threaded between adults with careful agility. their hands outstretched to keep from brushing damp fabric, their faces bright with the simple pleasure of being allowed to move. Lucille Marchand stood near a post, tying a knot with precise fingers, her scarf tucked neatly, her posture calm. When Edmund caught her eye, she offered that familiar small smile. "You came," she said, and the words were neither surprised nor flattering, only pleased, as if a quiet prediction had proven correct. "I wanted to hear," Edmund replied. Lucille nodded, as though that was reason enough. "Then listen," she said softly. "It begins the way most good things do, without announcing itself." For a time, the only music was the ship, the constant hum underfoot, the wind teasing cloth, the soft clink of a bucket's handle against wood. Voices drifted through it, brief exchanges, questions answered, a joke shared and allowed to dissolve into laughter. The soundscape was busy, yet it held no sharp edges. It felt like a woven blanket. Many threads, one warmth. Edmund leaned lightly on the rail and let his attention settle, the way one might let eyes adjust to a new light. Then, near the center of the deck, someone began to hum. It was not loud. It did not demand space. It simply appeared, a low melody threaded into the air as naturally as wind through linen. A woman, middle-aged with a scarf tied under her chin, hummed while she pinned a shirt, her breath shaping notes with quiet steadiness. The tune had the gentle rise and fall of a folk song, simple enough to remember, old enough to have traveled far. Edmund could not place its origin, but he recognized its purpose: to make work lighter, to make time feel held rather than spilled. The humming drew a response. Another voice joined, not copying exactly, but weaving a second line around it, as though the melody had offered a hand and been gladly taken. A young man near the bulkhead added a soft harmony, and the notes grew into something larger without ever becoming loud. The song did not belong to a stage. It belonged to the deck, to the pinned cloth, to the salt air. It turned the laundry lines into a kind of musical staff, the garments fluttering like silent notes above the singers' heads. Tomasz Kowalczyk appeared with a basket balanced on one forearm. He set it down and listened for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with the cautious confidence of someone stepping onto a floor he wants to test, he added a few words in his own language, short, rhythmic, carrying the weight of home. The words slid into the melody as if they had always been meant to be there. A woman nearby laughed softly in recognition, and the laughter did not interrupt. It simply brightened the song's edge. Nora Bell stood slightly apart, watching the scene with that steady calm of hers. When Edmund approached, she did not speak immediately. She listened as if listening were a kind of respect. "It's beautiful," Edmund said at last, keeping his voice low. Nora's eyes remained on the singers. "It's ordinary," she replied gently, "and that's why it matters. We don't have much room, so we make room in other ways." Edmund watched the way the song moved through the group. It did not erase differences of accent or language. It allowed them. It made a place where people could belong without needing to be the same. The effect felt faintly magical, not in the sense of impossible transformation, but in the sense of something quietly miraculous happening through human choice. The ship's hierarchy seemed less absolute under the song's canopy, as though the melody had softened the air that usually held boundaries in place. Mrs. Price, passing close by Edmund with a bundle of cloth, glanced at him sidelong. "You see?" she muttered. "No fancy instruments needed, just people who remember they've got voices." Lucille stepped nearer, her hands now free, her gaze thoughtful. "Songs travel more easily than trunks," she said. "They don't get weighed, they don't get inspected. They simply go where they are welcome, Edmund found himself considering the thought with a seriousness that surprised him. Upstairs, his world had always been measured. Weights, costs, distances, social rules that behaved like invisible fences. Down here, something else was being measured. How kindness could be stretched, how joy could be shared without diminishing, how dignity could be maintained even when space was scarce. The song above the laundry lines seemed to carry that measurement in its rhythm, marking the day not by schedules, but by a shared breath. As the melody continued, a child began to clap softly, out of time at first, then closer as someone beside her guided the rhythm with a gentle nod. The clapping remained quiet, more like encouragement than applause. A few more voices joined, and the song became a small tide, rising and settling without force. Edmund felt it loosen something in him. The habitual stiffness of his posture, the reflex to observe from a distance. He did not sing, he did not intrude, but his shoulders eased and his attention widened, and he allowed himself to be simply present. When the song reached its natural end, it did not conclude with a flourish. It faded the way daylight fades at the edge of a cloud, gradually, kindly, leaving warmth behind. The singers returned to their tasks with no ceremony, as though music were as practical as soap. Yet the air felt changed, as if the deck had been rinsed clean of something heavy. Conversations resumed, but they carried a lighter tone. Even the wind seemed pleased, tugging at the laundry with playful persistence. Nora turned slightly toward Edmund. "You'll remember it," she said, not as a command, but as a quiet certainty. "I think I will," Edmund replied. He looked at the laundry lines, at the cloth fluttering, at the sea beyond. "It's strange," he added, choosing his words carefully. "Upstairs, we have music performed for us. Here, you make it." Nora's expression remained calm, but her eyes held a hint of warmth. "We don't wait for permission," she said. "Not for small joys." Mrs. Price approached again, wiping her hands on her apron. "All right," she said briskly. "You've heard enough to start understanding, but not enough to start talking like an expert. That's the balance." Edmund smiled, accepting the correction as a kindness. "I'll try to keep it." Lucille, gathering a few clothespins into her pocket, looked toward a narrow side passage that led deeper into the third-class corridors. "If you like songs," she said softly, "there are stories down here too. Not performances, just people speaking plainly. Agatha keeps a kettle going most afternoons, and sometimes, when the air is right, someone reads a page aloud." Edmund felt the invitation settle in him like a new point on a map, one drawn not in red ink, but in gentle possibility. He nodded, and the nod felt less like agreement and more like gratitude given proper shape. "Then I will come," he said. Lucille's smile returned, small and sincere. "Tomorrow," she replied, as if marking the promise with the ease of someone who trusts that quiet commitments can be kept. The following afternoon arrived with a softer light, the kind that seemed to come not from the sun alone, but from the sea's steady reflection. The Aster Vale traveled onward with a quiet assurance, her hull cutting through the Atlantic in a way that felt almost ceremonial, as if the water itself were granting passage. Up on the first-class decks, the day continued in polished routines: cards, newspapers, the measured turning of pages in the lounge. Yet Edmund Ashford found that those comforts no longer held him with the same complete attention. They were pleasant, certainly, but they had begun to feel like one side of a coin, smooth, familiar, and only part of the story. He made his way down before the hour could slip away. The forward stairwell greeted him with its honest sense and practical sounds, and his steps found the rhythm of the ship's lower corridors with less hesitation now. He kept his gloves folded in his pocket and his hands empty, as Mrs. Price had advised. The gesture felt increasingly natural, as though he were learning a different etiquette, one that required presence rather than performance. In the common area near the galley doors, the kettle breathed its steady ribbon of steam. People gathered in their quiet clusters, cups warming their palms, voices braided into a gentle background. Mrs. Agatha Price noticed Edmund first and gave a brief nod that served as both greeting and approval. Lucille Marchand stood near a bench with a small bundle in her hands, her scarf tied neatly, her posture composed in the way of someone who never wasted emotion. Nora Bell sat nearby with her shoulders relaxed, the calm steadiness of her expression suggesting that she had made peace with the ship's narrowness by widening her patience instead. "You came," Lucille said, and her voice carried that faint musical lilt that made ordinary words sound slightly more graceful. "As promised," Edmund replied. Lucille's eyes held his for a moment, then she lowered her gaze to what she was carrying. It was a biscuit tin, plain metal, its painted label worn by time and handling. The lid bore faint scratches, and along the edge, a small dent suggested it had been dropped once and then forgiven. It looked unremarkable, the sort of container that might hold buttons or sewing notions, yet Lucille set it down with a care that made Edmund look more closely. "This is ours," she said softly, as if introducing a friend. "Not mine, not Nora's, everyone's in a way." Mrs. Price made a short sound of agreement. "Her little library," she explained, as though the phrase had become a known fact on the deck, like the location of the best corner out of the wind. "A library," Edmund repeated, surprised by how the word changed shape in this setting. In first class, a library meant shelves and polished wood, the quiet authority of leather spines. Here, it was a tin with a dent in it. Lucille lifted the lid. Inside lay a tidy arrangement of treasures: 2 small books with softened corners, a few folded pamphlets, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, and several loose pages carefully wrapped in cloth as if they were fragile. The paper smelled faintly of ink and salt air. Edmund watched Lucille's hands as she moved each item just enough to reveal it, as though she were showing the contents to the light so they could breathe. "They travel with us," Lucille said. "Words travel more lightly than trunks. They fit in places that bodies cannot." Nora leaned forward slightly, her expression warm with familiarity. "Sometimes someone brings a book," she added, "and sometimes someone has only a page, but it still counts." Mrs. Price snorted, though not unkindly. "Counts more than some people think. A ship can take your appetite and still feed you, but if it takes your imagination too, you arrive poorer than you left." Lucille's fingers paused over a small book with a faded cover. "This one was my father's," she said, and the words held no theatrical sorrow, only plain truth. "He liked to read aloud in the evenings, in the little room where we worked. When I packed, I could not take much. But I took this." Edmund found himself listening with the same attention he had given the songs under the laundry lines. There was a quiet reverence here, not for wealth or fine binding, but for the simple fact of something carried across water without being reduced to mere cargo. The tin was small, yet it held evidence that people did not cross oceans only with bodies and papers. They crossed with inner lives, memories, hopes, stories told quietly to keep the future from feeling too vast. Lucille reached into the tin and removed a folded pamphlet, then a page written in a careful hand. She showed them briefly, then returned them to their place. "We lend them," she said, "but carefully. You must bring them back, not because we do not trust, but because the next person deserves the same comfort." Edmund nodded. The idea of lending something so precious in a crowded place seemed to him like another form of the deck's quiet magic. Generosity practiced with discipline. In first class, books could be purchased or requested. Here, they were shared with the seriousness of limited resources and the tenderness of mutual respect. A few more passengers drifted closer, drawn by the familiar sight of the tin. Someone greeted Nora by name. Someone asked Lucille, in a language Edmund did not understand, whether the good story would be read again. Lucille responded with a smile and a brief reply that sounded like agreement. Nora reached into the tin and chose one of the small books. She held it as if it were a cup that might spill if gripped too tightly, then opened it with deliberate care. The room's sound shifted. It did not fall into perfect silence. Ships rarely offered that. But it softened, as though people had decided together to make space. The kettle continued to steam, a quiet companion. A spoon clinked once, then stilled. Even the ship's steady hum seemed for a moment to become the low note beneath a story. Nora began to read. Her voice was calm, neither overly dramatic nor flat. She shaped the sentences smoothly, letting them unfold as if she were unrolling a ribbon. The story itself was simple, something about a traveler meeting a stranger on a road, offering shelter without questions. Finding kindness returned in an unexpected form. Edmund did not recognize the book, but he recognized the way the listeners leaned toward it. A child stopped fidgeting and watched Nora's mouth as though the words might be seen as well as heard. An older man's shoulders loosened, his gaze drifting not to the walls of the ship, but somewhere beyond them, into the landscape the story had opened. As Nora read, the third-class quarters felt less narrow. The bunks and benches remained, the kettle remained, the scent of soap and boiled water remained, yet something else arrived too. Space made of attention. Edmund understood then what Mrs. Price had meant when she spoke of arriving poorer or richer. The body could endure cramped decks and plain meals. It was the spirit, quietly, that needed to be fed. When Nora reached a gentle pause in the narrative, she looked up. Her eyes traveled across the small group, faces softened, expressions attentive, and then, unexpectedly, to Edmund. For a moment, Edmund feared he had been indulged too long, tolerated like a curiosity. But Nora's gaze held no resentment. It held only the calm question of whether he could be included without making everything awkward. "Would you like to choose something?" Nora asked. Edmund's throat tightened with an emotion too mild to call shame, yet too meaningful to dismiss. In first class, invitations were frequent and often empty, offered because manners required them, not because they were truly desired. Here, the invitation felt different. It was not a test. It was a gesture of trust in a place where trust had to be built carefully, like a kettle kept steaming through shared attention. May I? Edmund asked, and the word sounded unfamiliar in his own mouth. He was used to taking what was offered upstairs because it was always offered. Here, asking felt like the right shape for respect. Lucille nodded. "Yes," she said simply, "but choose with care. Choose as if the words will keep someone company." Edmund leaned toward the tin. He did not plunge his hand in. He looked first at the worn covers, the folded pages, the ribbon-tied letters. He realized, with a quiet clarity, that every item in the tin had a weight that did not come from paper alone. Each piece was connected to someone's past, someone's endurance, someone's hope. His fingers hovered, then settled on a thin booklet with a plain cover and a title stamped faintly in ink. It looked like something printed cheaply, meant to be read and passed on. "This," he said, lifting it carefully. Lucille's eyes followed it, then she nodded again. "A good choice," she said. "It is short, but it is kind." Edmund held the booklet as if it might absorb the warmth of the room. He expected to feel patronized or to feel like an intruder holding a prop. Instead, he felt something more unsettling in its gentleness. The realization that inclusion was being offered to him without demand, without repayment, without a need for him to prove worthiness through status. The deck was inviting him into a form of humanity he had always assumed was automatic, and he saw now that it was not automatic at all. It was chosen, again and again, quietly, by people who had less reason to trust the world and still did. Mrs. Price watched him with a shrewd, approving look. "Don't keep it forever," she said briskly, though her tone softened at the end. "Bring it back, and if you like it, tell someone why. That's how a library grows." "I will," Edmund promised. He tucked the booklet inside his coat carefully, not as a possession but as a responsibility. Nora closed her book and set it back into the tin with the same care she had used to open it. "Tomorrow," she said, "we can read again. If the sea stays gentle." Edmund nodded, feeling the promise settle into him like a small, steady anchor. He rose after a respectful pause, offered a quiet thanks that did not try to sound grand, and stepped back into the corridor with the booklet close to his chest. As he climbed toward the brighter decks above, he carried more than paper. He carried the warm, modest wonder of a biscuit tin that held a world, and the simple invitation to return and hear it opened again. The Aster Vale carried on with the calm insistence of a well-built thing doing what it was made to do. Days blended into one another in a steady procession of light and weather. Mornings rinsed pale by sea mist, afternoons brightened by thin sun, evenings softened into amber along the rail. The ship's engines kept their patient rhythm, and the ocean answered with swells that rose and lowered like slow breaths. In first class, the patterns remained unchanged. Meals served at set times, chairs angled toward windows, newspapers folded and refolded. Yet Edmund Ashford began to feel those patterns as background rather than structure. The world upstairs still held comfort, but it no longer held all of his attention. He read the booklet he had borrowed from Lucille's biscuit tin in the quiet of his cabin, not as one might scan a pamphlet, but with the careful regard of someone holding another person's trust. The story inside was simple, as Lucille had said. Short lines about travelers, kindness offered without questions, and the way generosity sometimes returned by surprising routes. Edmund found himself pausing over certain sentences, letting them settle, as though the words were not merely ink, but small instructions. When he finished, he closed the booklet gently and felt an unfamiliar reluctance to set it down. It was not that the writing was extraordinary, it was that the circumstances made it matter. This was not a book purchased for amusement. It was a thread in a communal fabric, and he had been allowed to hold it for a while. At dinner that evening, conversation flowed as it always had, restrained, polished, safely distant from anything that might expose a raw edge. Someone mentioned a cousin's estate. Someone praised the ship's service. Someone made a mild joke about the sea's monotony. Edmund smiled when appropriate and offered brief remarks, yet he heard the hollowness between the lines more clearly now. The words did not offend him. They simply felt thin compared to the voices he had heard below. Voices that carried necessity and meaning without requiring elegance. He noticed, too, how often the people around him spoke of others as categories: crew, third class, immigrants, as if naming a group removed the need to consider an individual. After the meal, Edmund excused himself earlier than usual. The lounge was warm and bright, the map's red route line gleaming beneath glass, Yet he found the sight of it oddly incomplete. It could tell him where the ship was going, but not what the ship was holding. He walked toward the forward stairwell, his steps quiet on the carpet, and felt, with a strange sense of relief, the moment when polished silence gave way to more honest sound. He descended without hurrying, his gloves tucked away, his hands empty, his mind set on listening rather than gathering impressions. In the third-class common area, the kettle steamed as faithfully as ever. The air held the familiar mingling of soap, warm metal, and faint tea, and the corridor's voices threaded in and out like a gentle tide. Mrs. Agatha Price spotted him and gave him a brisk nod, as if checking him off an invisible list of people who had kept their word. "You've brought the booklet back?" she asked immediately, practical as always. Edmund reached into his coat and produced it. "Yes," he said, "and thank you for lending it." Mrs. Price took it and turned it once in her hands, checking its condition with the seriousness of a librarian. Satisfied, she placed it beside the biscuit tin where Lucille was already arranging the contents. Lucille glanced up, her expression calm and quietly pleased. "You returned it," she said, and there was something in her tone that made the act feel larger than it was, an affirmation that trust had not been misplaced. "I read it carefully," Edmund replied. "It was kinder than I expected a short booklet to be." Lucille's small smile appeared. "Kindness is not a matter of length," she said. Tomasz sat on the familiar bench, his large hands wrapped around a tin cup. He nodded at Edmund with that steady, assessing warmth that was not quite friendliness and not quite distance, but something honest in between. Nora Bell stood near the table, listening to a woman speak in a low voice about a brother waiting in a city across the ocean. Nora's attention was full, her posture relaxed but present, as if she offered the speaker a place to set her thoughts without fear of them being dismissed. Edmund did not interrupt. He took a seat at the edge of the gathering, as Tomasz had once instructed, so that his posture did not announce departure. He let his gaze rest softly, not roving like a tourist's, but staying with the speakers as though each voice deserved to be held. The woman's story was not dramatic. It was made of small facts: a letter received, an address memorized, the worry that handwriting might have changed since the last message. Yet the simplicity carried weight. Edmund understood, in a way he had never fully understood upstairs, that these were people balancing their futures on details as delicate as paper. When the woman finished, Mrs. Price made a practical remark about keeping letters dry, and someone else offered a small tin box for safekeeping. The exchange passed without ceremony, and the kettle continued to steam. Edmund listened to the next conversation, then the next. He heard Tomasz speak, briefly, about work, how a man could endure almost anything if he knew where he would stand when the day ended. He heard Lucille mention her dream of a shop with a front window, not grand, just clean and bright, a place where cloth could be measured and cut without hurry. He heard Nora describe the sister she hoped to find, and the way she had imagined that reunion so often it had begun to feel like a room she could step into. At one point, Nora's gaze drifted toward Edmund, and she seemed to recognize, without needing words, that he was listening differently than before. She stepped closer, her voice low enough to be private. "You come often now," she said. Edmund nodded. "I find it steadies me," he answered, surprised by the truth of it. "Upstairs, everything is arranged, so I don't have to notice anything. Here, I notice people." Nora's expression softened. "Noticing is a kind of respect," she said. "It's rarer than it ought to be." Edmund looked at his hands, empty and resting on his knees. "I thought respect was something you offered when it was required," he admitted. "By etiquette, by obligation. Mrs. Price, passing behind Nora with a cup, overheard just enough to snort softly. "Etiquette," she muttered, as if the word tasted stale. "Etiquette is what people use when they don't want to think. Respect is what you do when no one is making you." Edmund felt the remark land with gentle force. It was not an accusation. It was instruction, offered the way the ship offered wind and salt air, matter of fact, unavoidable, and oddly cleansing. He glanced around the common area, the biscuit tin resting like a small treasure chest, the kettle steaming as if generosity had its own fuel, the mismatched cups handled as carefully as fine china. He realized he had spent years moving through spaces where service and comfort were designed to erase the presence of other people's effort. Here, effort was visible, and because it was visible, it was honored. The conversation shifted, as shipboard conversation always did, drifting from practicalities to small memories, from hopes to jokes. A young man described the taste of apples from his village as if he could conjure them by describing them well enough. Someone else mentioned a river that froze each winter, turning into a road. The images were simple but vivid, and they filled the room with landscapes that did not belong to the ship. Edmund felt, for the first time, how a crowded deck could still contain expansiveness. It was not space of bodies, it was space of mind, opened by storytelling and shared attention. When a pause came, Edmund spoke quietly. He did not offer advice. He did not ask questions that would pry. He simply said, "Thank you for letting me sit here." And the words sounded plain, almost inadequate, yet they carried sincerity without ornament. Tomasz lifted his cup slightly, acknowledging. Lucille nodded, her hands returning to the biscuit tin as if tending it were tending the group's shared heart. Nora looked at Edmund with calm approval, not praising him, merely accepting the shape he was trying to take. Mrs. Price, always unwilling to let sentiment swell too large, pointed her chin toward the tin. "If you like words so much," she said, "you should hear Nora read again tomorrow. She does it well, makes the air feel less cramped." Nora's lips curved into a small, wry smile. "Agatha," she warned gently, as though Mrs. Price might embarrass her by being too direct. "It's true," Mrs. Price replied briskly. "No harm in truth. Tomorrow afternoon then, same place, same kettle. If the sea doesn't decide to show off." Edmund felt the invitation settle warmly in him. It was not dramatic, not urgent, yet it mattered more than many formal engagements he had accepted upstairs. He nodded. "I will come," he said, "and I will bring my listening." Lucille glanced up from the tin, her eyes bright with quiet approval. "Then you will be welcome," she said, as simply as that. When Edmund finally rose to leave, he did so slowly, as though he were careful not to disturb the room's gentle balance. The corridor outside felt cooler, the ship's hum more exposed, yet he carried the warmth of the gathering with him. As he climbed toward first class, he realized that he was beginning to learn a new skill, not the skill of navigating stairwells, but the subtler art of staying present with other people's lives. And ahead, in the steady rhythm of the crossing, waited tomorrow's reading, a promised hour of shared words, held together by steam, salt air, and attention given freely. The next afternoon arrived with a calm sea and a sky that looked newly swept. The Aster Vale moved steadily through a band of light that made the water shine in pewter and pale silver, and the wind carried a clean, bracing scent that seemed to rinse the mind as much as the air. On the upper decks, first-class passengers took their places in the familiar choreography, chairs angled toward the horizon, conversations arranged into agreeable shapes, while stewards moved like quiet clockwork, offering tea and folding away evidence of effort. Edmund Ashford participated just enough to avoid comment, then excused himself with the same mild politeness he had always used. Only now, the politeness had a new purpose, not to maintain distance, but to slip away without spectacle. He descended by the forward stairwell, his steps guided by habit that was becoming something like belonging. The ship's layers changed around him, polish fading to paint, carpet yielding to plain boards, scented air shifting towards soap and warm metal. The soundscape grew fuller, less hushed, voices, footsteps, the occasional laugh. And yet none of it felt harsh. It felt like a household with many rooms and many lives, all under the same roof of steel and sky. In the third-class common area, the kettle's steady steam rose like a familiar banner. Mrs. Agatha Price stood near it, supervising as if she were the keeper of a small civic ritual. Nora Bell sat with a book open in her lap, her posture relaxed but attentive, as if she had already begun listening to the words before she spoke them aloud. Lucille Marchand arranged cups with her precise hands, and Tomasz Kowalczyk leaned near the wall, his expression quietly observant. Edmund arrived without fanfare. Mrs. Price acknowledged him with a brisk nod. "Good," she said. "You're in time. Sit where you won't block the world." He took his place on the edge of the group, as he had learned to do, and allowed the room's gentle rhythm to settle around him. Nora began to read again, her voice calm and steady, shaping sentences that opened small landscapes inside the crowded space. The story this time carried the scent of fields and hearth smoke, of a traveler sharing a loaf with a stranger and finding the road less lonely afterward. The listeners leaned in as if the words were warmth. Even the ship's hum seemed to soften, becoming a low note beneath Nora's voice. When Nora finished, she closed the book carefully and returned it to the biscuit tin beside Lucille. A quiet satisfaction lingered, not loud enough to call joy, but steady enough to feel like it. People resumed conversation in low tones. A child, emboldened by the story's gentleness, asked a question about the sea's edge. An older man answered with a patient description of tides, as if explaining a friendly mystery. The kettle continued its faithful breathing, and cups passed from hand to hand with the same quiet dignity Edmund had come to recognize as the deck's true currency. It was then that someone produced bread. The loaf was plain, its crust browned unevenly, its shape slightly lopsided, as if it had been baked in a space that was not meant for artistry. Yet the way it was held, two hands cradling it carefully, made it seem important. Mrs. Price accepted it with a nod, then placed it on the scarred table as though laying down a small offering. A second item followed, a cloth bundle that, when opened, revealed a few slices of cheese and a smear of something preserved, perhaps jam, perhaps stewed fruit, saved with the careful patience of people who understood that small treats did not appear by accident. Edmund watched, surprised. He had eaten bread in first class that was sliced perfectly and served warm with butter shaped into neat curls. Here, this loaf carried a different kind of richness, not in ingredients, but in intention. The sharing began without announcement. Mrs. Price cut the loaf with a plain knife, her movements practiced, and passed the first pieces not to herself, but outward, as if the bread were meant to travel. "Take," she said to a young woman with a child, her tone brisk enough to hide tenderness. "And don't argue. Bread doesn't like arguments." The woman accepted with a quiet, grateful smile. The child held the piece with both hands as if it were a treasure. Lucille took a small portion and passed another to an older passenger, then offered the cloth bundle so someone could add a smear of sweetness. Tomasz received a piece, nodded once, and handed half of it to a man beside him without being asked. Edmund did not reach out. Not yet. Habit held him back. the old instinct that sharing belonged to those who lacked, and that his presence might unbalance the gesture. He expected, perhaps, that no one would offer him any. It would have been reasonable. Yet as the loaf made its rounds, Nora turned and held out a piece toward him, her expression calm and unembarrassed. "Mr. Ashford," she said softly, "would you like some?" The question was simple. It carried no challenge, no hidden lesson, yet it held the weight of inclusion. Edmund felt a brief tightening in his chest, the sensation of being offered a place without having earned it through the usual currencies of class and familiarity. "Yes," he said quietly, "thank you." He accepted the bread with both hands, as he had seen others do, and the warmth of it surprised him. Not literal warmth, though it retained a faint softness, but the warmth of the gesture itself. The crust was firm, the inside tender. He tasted a hint of salt, a hint of yeast, and then the sweetness of the preserved fruit when Lucille, with a small smile, offered the cloth bundle for him to add a smear. "Just a little," she advised gently, as if teaching him a practical skill. "It goes farther," Edmund followed her guidance. The sweetness was modest, but bright, as if it had captured sunlight and been folded away for later. He ate slowly, attentive to the taste and to the room's quiet motion. Around him, people spoke of small things. How the wind had shifted, how the laundry dried more quickly today, how the sea looked almost friendly. Yet beneath those ordinary observations ran a deeper current. The shared understanding that they were all, in their own ways, practicing courage. Tomasz, chewing thoughtfully, glanced toward Edmund. "First time bread like this?" he asked, his tone not mocking, simply curious. Edmund swallowed and answered honestly. "First time it has been offered like this," he said. "In first class, food arrives. It doesn't travel." Tomasz's mouth turned slightly at the corner. "Here it travels," he said. "Like us," Mrs. Price, overhearing, snorted. "And like us, it goes where it's needed, not where it's prettiest." Nora's eyes held a quiet warmth as she looked at Edmund. "We save little things," she said. "Not because we are miserly, because we like to remember we can still give." Edmund nodded, feeling the truth settle in him. Upstairs, giving often wore a costume, charity as a public event, generosity as a performance. Down here, giving was integrated into the day like wind and steam. It did not ask to be admired. It simply kept the world habitable. They ate in companionable calm. The sea beyond the porthole shifted through shades of silver, and the ship's wake traced its pale ribbon behind them. Edmund noticed how people held their bread, how they waited for others to have their share before taking more, how no one treated the loaf as something to be conquered. Even in scarcity, there was an etiquette here, unwritten, unannounced, yet stronger than many written rules. It was the etiquette of mutual care. As the last pieces were distributed, Mrs. Price wrapped what remained in cloth and set it aside with the decisiveness of someone who knew how to plan without fuss. "There," she said. "Now the day has had its sweetness. Don't expect it every hour." Lucille laughed softly, the sound light as a pinned handkerchief fluttering in wind. Nora's smile appeared, small but genuine. Tomasz leaned back against the wall, his expression calm. Edmund wiped his fingers on a napkin offered by a woman nearby. "Thank you," he said again, and this time the words felt less like a phrase and more like a stance, an acknowledgement of shared space, shared humanity. Nora's gaze drifted toward the sea. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how the ocean makes everyone equal, and the ship tries to pretend otherwise." Edmund did not respond immediately. He listened to the ship's hum, to the low murmur of voices, to the faint clink of cups. Then he said carefully, I think I'm beginning to understand that equality is not something the ocean gives. It's something people choose. Mrs. Price gave him a sharp look, then softened it with brisk approval. Careful, she said. That sounded almost wise. Edmund smiled, accepting the gentle tease. He rose after a respectful pause, not eager to leave, but mindful not to turn welcome into obligation. As he stepped into the corridor, the salt wind found him again, cool and clean. Behind him, the common area continued in its quiet, living rhythm. Kettle steaming, breadcloth folded, voices braided. At the stairwell, Edmund paused and looked back once, not out of sentimentality, but out of recognition. The third-class deck had become for him a place where the ship's true heart could be heard. And as he climbed toward first class, the taste of shared bread remained with him, simple, steady, and carrying the quiet promise that tomorrow he would return again, not as a visitor collecting impressions, but as a man learning, day by day, to belong through respect. As the Aster Vale moved deeper into the crossing, the ship began to feel less like a temporary conveyance and more like a small floating town with its own weather of habit and mood. The sea stayed cooperative, offering long, steady swells that lifted the hull with patient hands, and the sky shifted through pale grays and diluted blues, as if the Atlantic preferred quiet colors. On the upper decks, first class continued in its polished cadence. Tea trays, tidy conversations, the faint clink of cutlery like a metronome of comfort. Yet for Edmund Ashford, those familiar surfaces had begun to thin. He still walked the promenade, still nodded at acquaintances, still glanced at the map's red line beneath glass, but the route line no longer felt like the story of the journey. It was only the skeleton. The living body of it moved below, in steam and song and shared bread. He found himself listening differently everywhere now. In the lounge, when someone mentioned third class, with the casual tone reserved for weather or luggage, Edmund heard the emptiness in the phrase. It sounded like pointing at a door without caring what was behind it. A gentleman with a silver watch chain remarked that the lower decks must be a lively mess, and another replied with a faint chuckle, as if agreeing cost nothing. Edmund's hand tightened on his teacup, not in anger, but in a quiet discomfort that felt instructive. He could see, suddenly, how language could flatten people into categories, and how easy it was to treat that flattening as normal. He did not argue. The ship was not a courtroom, and he was not yet skilled in making truth land gently in a room that did not want it. Instead, he excused himself with polite brevity and went toward the forward stairwell, carrying his unease like a folded note. As he descended, the air shifted, soap and warm metal replacing polish, and the ship's hum grew clearer, as if the vessel itself were allowing him closer to its true voice. He arrived in the third-class corridor with the sense of stepping into a place where words had weight and faces could not be dismissed. The common area welcomed him with its familiar warmth. The kettle steamed. The biscuit tin sat on its usual surface like a small, battered treasure chest, and voices braided gently through the space. Mrs. Agatha Price glanced up and gave him her brisk nod of approval, as if confirming he had not forgotten the path. "You look as if someone upstairs has said something foolish," she observed, wiping her hands on her apron. Edmund exhaled softly, almost laughing at the accuracy. "Not foolish," he said. "Just careless." Mrs. Price snorted. "Careless is worse. Foolish can be corrected. Careless is a habit." Nora Bell looked up from where she was helping a child fold a scarf. Her gaze met Edmund's, calm and attentive. Lucille Marchand sat nearby with her sewing, the needle moving with quiet certainty. Tomasz Kowalczyk leaned near the wall, arms loosely crossed, watching the room with steady patience. The sight of them steadied Edmund more than he expected, like stepping onto a familiar patch of ground after walking on shifting boards. Edmund moved closer, and instead of taking his usual seat at the edge, he paused in the center of the room. He realized that for days he had been listening, learning, receiving. Now he wanted to do something small but meaningful, to make the people here real in his own mind in a way that could not be undone. He began with the simplest tool he had. Names. Nora, he said quietly, letting the syllables land with care. Lucille. Tomasz. Mrs. Price. Mrs. Price lifted an eyebrow. Agatha? She corrected briskly, though the corner of her mouth hinted at satisfaction. Agatha, Edmund repeated, accepting the correction as a gift rather than a reprimand. Nora's expression softened. It matters to you, she said, not as a question, but as an observation. It does, Edmund admitted. I've realized how often I've spoken about people as if they were a deck, a class, a number. Lucille's needle paused for a fraction of a second, then continued. Numbers are useful for luggage, she said softly. Not for hearts, Tomasz nodded once. Name is heavy, he added, searching for the right word. You carry it. Edmund felt a small warmth spread through him at the simplicity of the idea. Carrying a name. It sounded like something a person might do without noticing, yet it was the opposite of carelessness. It required attention. It required respect. Over the next hour, he made a quiet effort to learn more names. Mrs. Price, Agatha, introduced him to an older man with trembling hands named Mr. Halverson, who had a careful way of folding his napkin as though the act itself kept him calm. A young mother named Elsie Grant smiled shyly when Edmund addressed her directly, then relaxed as if surprised to find herself seen. A boy named Peter, freckles vivid against his wind-touched cheeks, looked at Edmund with open curiosity and then offered him a solemn nod, as if agreeing to a small pact of recognition. Edmund did not pry into their histories. He did not ask for dramatic details. He simply learned their names and let each one settle into place as a fact that mattered. The effect was subtle but profound. The room's sounds did not change, yet Edmund's experience of them did. Voices were no longer anonymous waves. They belonged to people. Even laughter carried identity, the way a familiar melody carries a signature. The third-class deck, which had once been an abstract below, became a map of individuals, and Edmund realized that this too was navigation, perhaps the most important kind. Later, when the kettle made its rounds, Edmund accepted his cup with a quieter gratitude than before. He watched the steam rise and thought of the red line on the first-class map. That line spoke of distance and direction, but the steam spoke of presence. Here, now, together. He noticed how the biscuit tin library traveled from hand to hand, how the sugar tin moved without hoarding, how the bench became a shared space rather than a claimed territory. Each small ritual depended on the same simple principle. Everyone was real. Mrs. Price sat for a moment, catching her breath, her eyes scanning the room with the vigilance of someone who had learned to keep a crowded world from fraying. Edmund sat nearby and asked carefully, "Do you ever grow tired of managing everything?" Mrs. Price's laugh was brief and dry. "Managing? I'm not managing. I'm noticing. Someone has to. If you don't notice, you end up with cold tea and bruised feelings." Edmund nodded, understanding the larger meaning. Noticing again. The word returned like a refrain. Nora joined them, her hands folded loosely. "People think we come here with nothing," she said quietly. "But we bring whole worlds. They just don't look like trunks." Edmund looked around at the bunks arranged like honeycomb, at the coats hung neatly, at the small treasures tucked into corners. He thought of Lucille's biscuit tin, of Tomash's careful half-loaf offered without hesitation, of Mrs. Price's brisk competence that held the deck together like stitching. These were not empty lives. They were crowded with meaning. In the late afternoon, Edmund returned upstairs briefly, as he had to maintain the appearance of normalcy. A steward greeted him, offered tea, and mentioned the day's position on the route map. Edmund thanked him, glanced at the red line, and felt, for the first time, how incomplete it was as a measure of travel. In the lounge, a woman commented on how the lower decks must be awfully noisy, and someone else agreed with a faint smile. Edmund set his teacup down gently and said in a calm voice that did not seek confrontation, "It's less noise than you might think. It's life, and it's remarkably organized." The woman blinked, surprised. A brief pause followed, the sort that could harden into awkwardness if pressed. Edmund did not press. He simply offered a small nod and moved away, letting the statement stand as a quiet correction rather than a challenge. He felt no triumph, only a steady sense that he had refused to participate in carelessness for one moment longer. When he returned below later, the third-class corridor felt like a place where his own thoughts could breathe. Lucille looked up from her stitching and, without fanfare, gestured toward an empty spot beside her. "Sit," she said. "You look as if you have been holding your tongue." Edmund sat, grateful for the simple acceptance. "I have," he admitted. Lucille's needle moved in smooth arcs. "Sometimes the tongue must rest," she said softly. "But the heart can still speak by how it behaves." Mrs. Price nodded approval from across the room. "Tomorrow," she called, brisk as ever, "we'll have more tea, and if Nora feels generous, maybe another chapter. And if you keep learning names, you'll soon run out of excuses to treat anyone like a shadow." Edmund felt the invitation land like a warm hand on his shoulder. He looked at Nora, who gave a small nod as if confirming the plan, and at Tomasz, who lifted his cup in quiet agreement. The ship's hum continued beneath them, steady as a heartbeat, and Edmund realized that each day below was teaching him a new map, one drawn not in ink and distance, but in names that had become real, and in the simple promise of returning again. The days began to carry a faint sense of nearing, as if the horizon ahead held more than open water, and the ship could feel it in her steel bones. The Aster Vale still moved with steady patience, her engines keeping their low, faithful rhythm, and the Atlantic remained calm enough to encourage conversation rather than endurance. In first class, excitement showed itself in tidy ways. A few more letters written, a few more glances at the route map, an extra flourish of perfume before dinner. Down below, anticipation took a different shape. It traveled in practical questions. Who would meet whom? Which address would be found first? How to keep papers safe and hands warm? The same ocean held both moods without favor, and the ship kept carrying them together. Edmund Ashford found himself living in two atmospheres. Upstairs, he maintained the outward habits expected of him, the polite nods, the measured conversation, the quiet agreement with other gentlemen's remarks. Yet the words he used there began to feel like clothing cut for a body he no longer entirely inhabited. Downstairs, he moved with less self-consciousness now, his steps guided not by accident, but by quiet intention. He listened more than he spoke. He learned names. He noticed the small systems that held third class together, the kettle's schedule, the biscuit tin's careful lending, the unspoken rules of making room. It was that noticing, Mrs. Price would have called it the beginning of sense, that led him to a decision. Not a grand decision, not the sort announced with speeches. A quiet one, shaped by humility and the desire not to turn his newfound respect into another kind of performance. He had seen enough to understand that offering help could easily become an insult if it arrived wearing superiority. Down here, dignity was not begged for. It was practiced. If he were to give anything, it would have to fit that practice. He began upstairs, where resources moved more freely. One afternoon, he sought the purser in a small office that smelled of paper, ink, and shipboard discipline. The purser was a tidy man with calm eyes, accustomed to turning human concerns into lists and receipts. Edmund spoke with measured simplicity, careful to keep his tone practical rather than sentimental. "I would like to arrange a few small items," Edmund said, discreetly, "for passengers in third class." The purser's eyebrows lifted. "Charitable arrangements can be made," he replied, already reaching for a ledger, as though charity were another form of cargo. Edmund held up a hand. "Not charity," he corrected gently. "Please, practical assistance." Quietly delivered. No announcements. The purser studied him for a moment, perhaps looking for vanity, then found instead a seriousness that did not ask to be admired. "Very well," he said. "What sort of assistance?" Edmund had thought carefully. Nora Bell had mentioned once, in a low voice, that the wind found its way into the children's corners more easily than into adult coats. He had seen a young child's thin blanket folded with such precision, it seemed almost formal. He had also noticed Lucille's sewing kit, tidy, well-kept, yet limited, and the way she rationed thread as if it were precious metal. Tomasz, in his practical manner, had spoken of work prospects with the quiet urgency of a man who knew introductions could change everything without needing to be dramatic. "A warmer blanket," Edmund said, "for a child traveling with Mrs. Nora Bell." He did not mention the child's name. He did not want the purser to turn a person into an entry on a page. "A small box of needles and thread," he added, "for Miss Lucille Marchand. Good quality. Nothing extravagant, but reliable. And there may be an agent or hiring clerk who meets the ship at port, a man who arranges work in the docks or yards. I would appreciate any discreet introduction for Mr. Tomasz Kowalczyk, if such a contact exists." The purser's pen paused. "You know their names," he said, more observation than question. "I do," Edmund replied, "and I would like them treated as names, not categories." The purser nodded slowly, as though something in the request adjusted his own view of the ledger. "I can arrange these things," he said. "Discreetly, as you asked. There will be no mention of your name unless you instruct otherwise." Edmund considered, then shook his head. "No mention," he said. "If gratitude must be given, let it be given to the ship's good order, or to luck, or to anything other than me." The purser's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Understood," he said, and returned to his ledger with a steadiness that suggested he, too, understood the value of quietness. When Edmund returned below that afternoon, he did not arrive with parcels under his arms. He arrived as he always had, empty-handed, attentive, his gloves tucked away. The common area held its familiar warmth. The kettle steamed. The biscuit tin rested where Lucille kept it. Mrs. Price's presence anchored the room like a firm stitch. Nora sat nearby, folding a small garment with careful hands. Tomasz spoke quietly with Mr. Halverson, their heads bent toward each other in practical conversation. Edmund took his seat at the edge, as he had learned to do. He listened while Nora read a few pages from a book, her voice smoothing the air. He joined in the small talk afterward, brief remarks about wind and light, a quiet laugh when Mrs. Price muttered something sharp about the ship's bread being brave but not talented. He did not mention his visit to the purser. He did not even hint that he had done anything beyond showing up. The restraint felt necessary, not as self-denial, but as respect. Later, a steward appeared in the corridor, his uniform crisp, even in the warmer air of third class. He carried a folded blanket, thicker than most, and a small, plain parcel. The sight drew a few glances, then settled, as shipboard life always did, back into rhythm. Mrs. Price stood, hands on hips, ready to intercept nonsense if nonsense appeared. The steward approached Nora first. "Mrs. Bell?" he asked, checking a small note in his hand. Nora looked up, surprised. "Yes," she replied. "A blanket," the steward said simply. "For your little one. Ship stores, requested for improved comfort. No charge." Nora's hands hovered, then accepted the folded wool with careful reverence. She did not gasp. She did not perform gratitude. Yet her face softened in a way Edmund recognized as relief. She pressed her palm to the blanket as if confirming it was real. "Thank you," she said quietly. And the words were not directed at any person in particular, just into the air, into the ship, into whatever had made this small mercy appear. The steward turned to Lucille. "Miss Marchand?" Lucille straightened, her needle paused between fingers. "Yes?" The steward handed her the parcel. "Sewing supplies," he said. "Needles, thread, ship's stores, requested for practical work." Lucille took it and opened it just enough to see the contents. Her eyes widened slightly at the quality of the thread, the neatness of the needles, the small indulgence of having choices rather than making do with what remained. She closed the parcel again with care, as though she were sealing gratitude inside. "That is very kind," she said, her voice soft but steady. She did not ask who had arranged it. Perhaps she understood, instinctively, that asking would turn the gift into a transaction. Finally, the steward approached Tomasz. "Mr. Kowalczyk," he said, and Tomasz looked up, his expression alert. "There will be a hiring clerk at port," the steward continued. "A Mr. Harlan working with the dockyards. If you present yourself at the aft gangway after disembarkation begins, I can indicate where he will stand. He has been told to expect you." Tomasz's eyes held a brief flash of surprise, then settled into something like gratitude tempered by pride. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. "I understand," he said. "Thank you." The steward departed as quietly as he had arrived, leaving the room with its steady hum and its suddenly softened edges. For a moment, no one spoke. The gifts had landed without fanfare, like snow falling without sound. Then Mrs. Price cleared her throat in her brisk manner. "Well," she said as if commenting on weather. "That's useful." Nora hugged the blanket briefly, then folded it neatly, already planning where it would go. Lucille set the parcel beside her tin, her fingers lingering on it as if recognizing not its price, but its respect. Tomasz exhaled and rubbed his hands together, as though warming them on the thought of possibility. Edmund remained still. He did not watch their faces for a reaction that would flatter him. He watched only long enough to be sure the gifts had not embarrassed them. He felt no swelling triumph. He felt, instead, a quiet steadiness, relief that he had managed to give without taking dignity in return. Nora's gaze drifted to him, thoughtful. She did not accuse or praise. She simply looked, as if seeing a new shape in his presence. "You've been busy upstairs," she said softly. Edmund met her eyes and chose his words with care. "Only a little," he replied. "The ship has stores. It seemed sensible they should be used where they matter." Nora studied him, then nodded once, accepting the explanation without pressing it into confession. "Sensible," she repeated, and the word sounded like approval in her mouth. Lucille, touching the parcel lightly, added in her musical voice. A gift given properly feels like a window opened, not a debt. Mrs. Price gave Edmund a sharp look, then softened it with a gruff kind of warmth. "If that was you," she said bluntly, "then you did it the right way. Quiet, useful, no bows." Edmund lowered his gaze. "I'm learning," he said. Tomasz lifted his cup slightly, the gesture steady and respectful. "Learning is good," he said. Most men stop. The kettle steamed on, as if approving the room's new warmth. Outside, the sea continued its steady breath. And as Edmund rose to leave later, Lucille spoke softly, her eyes on the biscuit tin. "Tomorrow," she said, "we will read again. And perhaps, if the wind stays gentle, someone will sing." Edmund nodded, feeling the promise settle like a calm, guiding star. He left the common area carrying nothing visible, no parcels, no praise, only the quiet knowledge that respect could be practiced in actions so small they blended into the ship's own rhythm, and that tomorrow he would return to the kettle's steam and the shared words that made the crossing feel human. The air changed first. It arrived in the early hours like a subtle shift in a room. No sudden announcement, no dramatic gesture, just a different scent carried on the wind, a faint suggestion of earth beneath the clean salt. The Aster Vale continued her steady work through the Atlantic, yet the ship seemed to move with a new kind of intention, as if the steel itself could sense the nearing of land. The sky held a pale clarity, and the sea looked smoother, less like an endless expanse and more like a surface leading somewhere. Even the ship's hum sounded slightly brighter, as though the engines had begun to anticipate rest from their long, faithful labor. Up on the first-class deck, anticipation dressed itself in polish. Passengers appeared earlier than usual, coats buttoned, hats adjusted, gloves smoothed with nervous fingers. There were more glances toward the horizon, more murmured questions directed at stewards, more talk of arrival times and customs formalities. The route map in the lounge drew a small crowd, and the red line that had crept so slowly day by day now felt suddenly urgent, as if it wished to leap to its final point. Edmund Ashford stood near it for only a moment before turning away. The map could confirm what he already knew, that the ship was nearing her destination. It could not measure what had changed within him during the crossing. He walked to the promenade rail and looked out. The horizon held a faint shadow that was not cloud, not trick of light. A low, dark line rested against the pale sky. Distant land, quiet and undeniable. Around him, first-class voices rose and softened, full of plans. Hotels, meetings, introductions, schedules that would begin the moment shoes touched shore. Edmund listened, and for the first time he heard those plans as one set of hopes among many, no more sacred than the hopes carried below. He felt no disdain for his class's comfort. He simply felt the illusion of exclusivity slip away, leaving a clearer, calmer view of what travel truly did. It placed different lives side by side and asked them, without words, to recognize each other. He excused himself with practiced ease and descended toward third class, not to escape first class, but to honor the part of the ship that had taught him more than any map. The corridors changed around him as they always did, polish fading, air warming, the ship's sounds becoming more honest. And yet today, the lower decks carried a particular energy. It was not frantic. It was focused, like hands tightening knots before a long walk. People moved with purpose, folding blankets, tying bundles, checking papers, smoothing clothing as if preparing to meet the future face to face. The atmosphere held that distinctive blend of salt air and soap and warm metal, but now it was threaded with something else, anticipation sharp enough to taste. In the common area, the kettle still steamed. It seemed impossible that it could continue after so many days. Yet there it was, faithful as ever, breathing warmth into the air. Mrs. Agatha Price stood near it, directing with brisk efficiency as if she were organizing a village festival rather than a ship's arrival. Lucille Marchand had her small case open on her lap, checking needles and thread with careful fingers, then closing it as though sealing her craft and her hope together. Nora Bell folded the new blanket, thick, warm, into a neat square and tucked it into her bundle with reverent practicality. Tomasz Kowalczyk stood with his bag at his feet, his posture steady, his gaze attentive in the way of someone preparing to step into work the moment he steps onto land. Edmund entered quietly, and several faces turned toward him with recognition rather than surprise. That alone felt like a quiet miracle. He was no longer simply the gentleman who had wandered down by mistake. He was Edmund, known by name, welcomed without ceremony. "Land," Mrs. Price said, as if reporting the weather. "We'll be rid of this floating town soon enough." Nora's eyes warmed slightly. "And we'll be in a new one," she added, her voice calm but carrying a deeper current. Edmund sat where he had often sat, near enough to be present, far enough not to take more space than needed. He listened while the room spoke in practical details: where to queue, how to keep documents dry, what to do if separated from family in the crush of disembarkation. These were not theatrical worries. They were the kind that lived in the hands and shoulders. Mrs. Price offered brisk advice, like a seamstress stitching last-minute reinforcement into a hem. "Keep your papers inside your coat," she told a young man. "Not in a bag. Bags get pulled. Coats stay on bodies." Lucille nodded, adding softly, "And write your address on more than one scrap. Ink is loyal, but water is persistent." Tomasz checked the strap of his bag again, then glanced at Edmund. "You go first," he said, not accusingly, merely stating the ship's order. Edmund nodded. "Yes." Tomasz's gaze held Edmund's a moment. "But you come here," Tomasz added, as if that fact mattered more than the ship's hierarchy. "So you know, we all go to same land." "We do," Edmund agreed. Nora looked down at her bundle, then back up. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how close everyone is on a ship, and how quickly it can all separate." Mrs. Price snorted, though her eyes softened. "That's why you remember names," she said briskly. "Names are how you hold on without clinging." Edmund felt the truth of it settle in him. Throughout the crossing, he had watched names turn from labels into lives. He had watched how a biscuit tin could become a library, how a kettle could become a clock, how laundry lines could become a stage for song. He had learned that hope was not a grand banner reserved for those who could afford it. Hope was a small, stubborn light carried in many pockets. Outside, the ship's horn sounded, lower than on departure, less like a call into fog and more like an announcement to a listening shore. The vibration of it traveled through the ship's structure and into the common area, and people paused briefly, as if acknowledging the sound together. Then the motion resumed. Bundles tightened, knots checked, scarves adjusted. The future waited with open hands and unknown expressions. Edmund rose, feeling the moment approach when he would have to return to first class and disembark according to his ticket. He did not want his departure from the common area to feel like abandonment. Yet he understood now that belonging did not require constant presence. It required respect that traveled with him. He turned to Nora first. "I hope you find your sister quickly," he said, keeping his voice low and sincere. Nora's expression held calm gratitude. "I hope you find what you're looking for too," she replied. "Even if it isn't written on your map." Edmund smiled faintly at that. He turned to Lucille. "Your sewing, your work will be needed," he said. "I believe you'll make your shop." Lucille's eyes brightened, not with giddy excitement, but with a steady confidence. "Perhaps," she said softly. "And perhaps I will hang a curtain in the window and let light come through." He turned to Tomasz. "May your meeting with Mr. Harlan go well," Edmund said, and he meant it with a sincerity that surprised him in its steadiness. Tomasz nodded once, firm. "Work is work," he said, "but it is good to begin with a door already open." Finally, Edmund looked at Mrs. Price, Agatha, whose brisk competence had held this corner of the ship together like a strong seam. "Thank you," he said. It felt inadequate, so he added the only thing that seemed to carry the right weight. "For teaching me to notice." Mrs. Price's eyes narrowed, then softened into something like approval. "Just don't forget," she said. "Not when you're back in your polished rooms. The world doesn't improve because one gentleman had a thoughtful week. It improves when he keeps behaving thoughtfully after." "I will," Edmund promised. Mrs. Price waved him away with her usual refusal of sentiment. "Go on then. You've a cue to stand in and a hat to keep on straight." Edmund stepped into the corridor, the common area's warmth behind him. As he climbed toward first class, he felt the ship's hierarchy reassert itself in signage and carpet and the return of polished quiet. Yet it no longer felt inevitable. It felt like one arrangement among many, a set of habits that could be questioned. On the upper deck, he joined the line of first-class passengers preparing to disembark. Ahead, land grew clearer, buildings faint, then sharper, the suggestion of docks and cranes. The air carried more unmistakable earth, and the gulls sounded different, as if they belonged to the shore rather than the sea. When the gangway was lowered and the first step toward land became possible, Edmund paused for a fraction of a second at the rail. He looked down toward the aft, where third class would line up later, their bundles close, their faces lifted toward the same new world. He did not wave dramatically. He did not try to bridge the ship's structure with a grand gesture. Instead, he pressed his hand lightly to the cool rail, as if acknowledging the vessel that had held them all. And he carried something unseen with him as he stepped forward. The names he had learned, the respect he had practiced, and the quiet understanding that hope had never belonged to a ticket class, only to the hearts willing to recognize one another on the same wide water.